Scouting over the last couple years in the section of woods that borders the easement of the power line, it demonstrated a fair amount of sign, and we decided to put some cameras up to see what kind of activity was in the area. We had positioned our cameras in a traditional north-south direction and initially only saw a few bucks and a few doe. However, this changed significantly when we changed the direction of the cameras by 45 degrees to look to the northeast and to the southwest. Just inside the woods, we have a relatively flat area that we call the bench, and this runs a good 100 yards to the east and is fairly wide, at least about 40 yards, before it drops off down towards the creek. This area is very rich with sign, with a lot of rubs and scrapes, and we subsequently saw a fair amount of deer activity with the cameras once we had them repositioned. You can see the parade of bachelor bucks along this area that is the most prominent trail that runs from Big Rack up to the south bench. Besides does and fawns, we've seen a few of the older bucks that have also traversed along this corridor. Cruising along the power lines, we've cut an area with bush hog that parallels the woods. This makes it a little bit easier access to get down to an entry point. There is a break in the thicket that the deer have been using to access the woods in the area that we call the bench. As you may be able to notice, there are many smaller trees that we can ride through and along, and this will access us to the area that's probably the best vantage to get a view of the bench from all the sides. Unfortunately, with all these small trees, we have only a few larger diameter trees that may be able to support a tree stand, and these are not in the optimal location. You can see our cameras to the right side, and to the left side is the flattest area and the most common corridor for the majority of the deer activity that we've been able to see, at least by camera and occasionally when we ride along through this area. The view from this area, sweeping from the northwest, then to the west, and then eventually the southwest, before we're finally looking due south to where Kimber's standing, is just about the optimal location for an elevated blind. The first blind we constructed was the redneck blind we put on the border of the hayfield. Next, we had a temporary blind utilizing a ground blind, which we later converted to the platform blind, which unfortunately was destroyed by wind and weather and had to be replaced by a modified vinyl shed. A prefab is down at the big rack, and another converted vinyl shed is at Misery Hill called the Misery Condo. The sturdiest blind that we have is the one that we constructed about 8 years ago. We initially constructed it in the barn, then the boys reconstructed it down by the creek field, and it is probably the most durable blind that we have so far out in the field. Skyrocketing lumber prices from the pandemic and availability of pallet wood brought about the birth of a new hobby of dumpster diving. Government restrictions in response to the emerald ash borer made it much more restrictive to utilize pallets for reuse. We've found that there are many pallets that have been used only once, discarded by a number of manufacturers, and available for easy pickup. 8-foot 2x4s that have been used only once on these pallets rival the 2x4s that you can get from the box stores, which cost upwards of $10 a piece. Breakdown of the pallets at home was much more feasible since I had availability of short increments of free time, and then later transporting these out to the farm to go ahead and stack them in the barn for later use. We were able to get a number of 2x4s as well as the siding elements that we were going to be using for the blind. My grandson, Easton, was eager to help out as much as he could. He enjoyed unloading the pickup and then toting the pallet boards into the barn, then sorting them by length and width and thickness to make sure that they were stacked appropriately. Kimber did her part also as guard dog to make sure that the slats, once they were piled up in the barn, didn't walk off on their own. Without 2x6 or 2x8s available, we doubled 2x4s to make the floor joists, then top these off with the heavier panels, which were a little over a half an inch in thickness. Once we had the floor base established, the next task was to start framing out the walls. We started with the wall that was going to be facing the north to use this as a template, and the blind was going to be 6 foot by 6 foot in dimension. We had to individually cut the pieces together so that we could measure out the height of the center window that would be optimal for viewing and shooting pleasure. Since our lumber was not 100% straight, it often needed a little bit of encouragement to place the pieces appropriately before we could nail them. We decided to make our window openings for at least 3 of the walls 11 inches by 23 inches. That way we'd have an adequate opening, and although we plan on only using outside shuttered windows, we may be able to splurge in the future to go ahead and put some 12 by 24 deer view glass windows in at a later time. Once we had the basic framing done for the wall, the next step was going to be to go ahead and put a layer of roofing felt on the outside aspect. This was going to serve several purposes. One, this would be a little bit of a windbreak since the outside panels were not going to be completely airtight. On the next aspect, it was going to provide a layer of protection from some of the insects to keep them from invading the inside in greater numbers. The last aspect was probably the best in that it was going to provide a black wall for the inside of the blind. This way it would make it much more difficult to see in the blind from the outside. Once we had completed placing the roofing felt, we had to cut the thin, wider pallet slats to the appropriate length so that they could be fitted onto the wall. We decided to try the Japanese art of Shishujiban in an effort to cut down on the insect infestation of the wood. This was also going to provide a little bit extra moisture control. In addition, we were going to see how this does in an effort to preserve the wood without having to go to the extra time as well as the expense of painting the outside walls or staining them. Once we had finished heat treating the thinner, wider pallet slats that we had selected for our wall siding, we went ahead and put those in place. We had marked the position of the 2x4s that they needed to be fixated to and proceeded to nail them in place. Once we completed our first wall, we went ahead and constructed an outside window in a shutter fashion, which was hinged at the top. This way we could open the shutter window and help deflect any rain from coming in during adverse conditions. We were able to then start the second wall that was going to contain the door. Kimber was making a point to challenge whoever was over at the neighbors. If it had been Greg or Cooper, his dog, she usually doesn't bark and runs on over for a little extra affection. After we finished the west wall that had the door, we finished out the south and east walls and then proceeded to disassemble these so that we could heat treat the frames before we put the siding on. Working with the pallet wood that we had, we found that it was not always completely straight and true. It was similar to the stud grade 2x4s that you get at the big box stores, which can be extremely crooked. This made it necessary to take each bracing piece and cut it to fit when we were framing the walls, and this was particularly a challenge when we were constructing a door that we were trying to make straight and true out of crooked wood. Although it was a challenge, we managed to frame a door that was relatively straight despite bowed wood and at right angles. I did leave the bottom section with a little bit of leeway in case we needed to cut some off when we finally hung the hinges. We got it heat treated and ready to go. We had one pallet which was exceptionally sturdy and heavy duty. We decided to leave this intact and not break it down in its components so that we could use this as an entrance platform that we could attach to the blind and also attach stairs to it. besides serving as an insect repellent, a moisture repellent, and a fire retardant, the heat treating of the wood provides for a little bit enhancement of the appearance. With the base completed and the walls framed and sided, we just needed to frame out a cap for the blind itself. We framed out a structure with a 12-degree slope to enhance the water runoff, and Matt came out and was able to heat treat the frame to get us well on our way. John and Dustin came out along with Matthew last weekend, and they got indoctrinated in the Japanese art of heat treatment of wood. Their initial plan was that we would get things fairly well completed with the roof cap and then go ahead and head on over to the south part of the property and start the assembly process of the blind. Unfortunately, the weather was not in our favor, and we weren't able to make the trek to assemble the blind since the trails were a little too muddy for the vehicles to traverse the steep hills. We have been on that slippery slope before and did not want to repeat that experience. After they were cut short, and with their thin nature, we had problems with the nail gun, placing the nails very close to the edge with splitting the siding panels. John had to resort to pre-drilling through the thin panels before using this old-fashioned hammer to drive the nails home to finish up the siding on the roof cap.
Some miracle.
Snapping a chuck line and using a circular saw to take off the rough edges of the roof cap were the near final efforts that we had to make to finish up the roof cap and make things ready for assembly as soon as the weather starts to break.
These stupid fucking guards.
The roof cap has been completed. The south wall shutter hinge window has been completed. The door has been hinged and the window hung for the north wall, and the east wall also has the hinged window finished. We just need a break in the weather so that we can get over to assemble the blind.